So, with this lecture, we're picking up the story in Egypt where we left off, and just might start by making sure we all know where Egypt is. At the very beginning, we talked about the fact that you can't really talk about the Middle East without including Egypt, even though it is also part of Africa. So, we left off with Egypt deep in the process of modernization under at this point, the ruler was a fellow named Isma'il. Just to remind you, technically Egypt's still part of the Ottoman Empire, though in actual practice, pretty much autonomous. But the title kind of reflects this of the ruler, Khedive or viceroy, literally governor. And so he's ruling over Egypt from 1863 until at some point, and we're going to find out what happens, the British force him to step down in 1879. And so he's continuing with a project that was actually begun by his predecessors, starting with Muhammad Ali, and in many regards, it's really mostly a case of, shall we say, stepping down hard on the gas, right? Where this kind of whole modernization process is really now picking up pace. And the problem is, in order to do this, he's going to put Egypt heavily in debt. And in fairness to, say, Muhammad Ali, Muhammad Ali did not borrow a single penny in order to finance the reforms that he carried out in Egypt. He had relied primarily on revenue generated by the production of cotton as a cash crop. Isma'il, on the other hand, is going to borrow extensively, primarily from Europe, especially the British and French. And that eventually is going to put him in a bit of a problem. And part of this reflects the fact that banking practices at this time are incredibly exploitative, particularly when they're directed at non-European countries. And part of the problem also had been that for a while there had been a bit of a cotton boom. During the American Civil War, Egypt effectively cornered the market on cotton. The price had gone up, related to which he was getting relatively fairly favorable interest rates as far as loans. After the Civil War, price of cotton goes down, interest rates go up, and at some point Egypt is pretty much unable to service the debt. Now, we should note he is making incredible advances, in terms of at least infrastructure in the modernization of Egypt. If you were to visit Cairo in, say, the mid to late 1860s, it would have seemed more European than, say, New York. In terms of kind of the buildings, broad boulevards, proper plumbing, street lighting and things of that nature. And also in terms of building roads, there's some advancements made educationally, the establishment of schools, development of curriculums and so forth. At least he is actually accomplishing something. On the other hand, there's nothing by way of political reform, and we're starting to see a clamoring for that. But he's definitely autocratic. Nothing as far as development of representative institutions and so forth. His whole thing was for him, modernization meant imitating Europe. He very famously said, "My country is no longer in Africa, we are now part of Europe." But this is creating problems, not least financially. And the debt becomes so huge at some point that the British and French in particular are concerned that Egypt might default on what they owe. And there's a lot of pressure on the British and French governments in connection with this, right? So, a lot of this money that has been loaned to Egypt, some of it coming from the governmental level, but also from banking institutions and even private investors, all of whom are putting pressure on the British and French governments to make sure that their investments are protected. And so eventually in 1878, the British and French are going to impose a dual financial control on Egypt, which basically means that the British and French will be in charge of all of Egypt's financial matters. They'll be in charge of revenue and expenditure. They call this a constitutional ministry. So literally, you're going to have a British official as Minister of Finance and a French minister as Minister of Public Works, meaning that an English official is overseeing revenue and a French official is managing the country's expenditures. Imagine if the United States at some point incurred such a heavy debt load with China that China imposed Chinese ministerial control over, say, the Department of Treasury. Right now, militarily, the United States would be able to kind of resist that. Egypt isn't in that position, right? There's really not much they can do. So they have to accept this arrangement. And, Isma'il himself is not too happy about it, though for him, it isn't so much about Egyptian nationalism, but more about his own personal control. Eventually, the British find him not to be sufficiently amenable to whatever it is they want to see happen, and they force him to step down in favor of his son Tawfiq, who is installed as Khedive of Egypt in 1879. And pretty much, the reason they wanted him is he's going to prove to be a useful puppet. And he will actually continue in this position even after the British occupation, which we're getting to shortly, until his death in 1892, when he's succeeded by his eldest son, Abbas II. So a lot of Egyptians are very unhappy with this arrangement. And, to some degree, this is being spurred on by the growing influence of Egyptian nationalism. By this point, many Egyptians, many of them becoming much better educated and so forth, are starting to think in more nationalistic terms, thinking of themselves as Egyptians. And obviously, within that framework, not too happy about this degree of foreign rule, right, over Egyptian finances. On the other hand, this is actually going to become a catalyst to spur Egyptian nationalism on further, right? There's nothing like a them, a kind of oppositional them, to create a clearer sense of who the us, quote unquote us, is. And eventually, Egyptian nationalism is going to find a spokesperson in the form of an Egyptian army officer named Ahmed Urabi, who in some ways is very ideally suited for this role, because up until this point, it was only recently that indigenous Egyptians had been able to become part of the officer class. That had been kind of reserved up until shortly before this for the descendants of the Mamluks, right? These, the former kind of ruling elite of Egypt, in some ways still kind of a ruling elite, those who had filtered down into society. So, he's going to become the spokesperson for this movement. And I should note, right, they're not only upset about foreign domination, but they also want constitutional reform. Many of them are actively seeking a representative form of government, right? And so this does kind of reflect the influence of European ideology to some degree, ideas coming out of the Enlightenment about how government should be for the people, of the people, and by the people. And so, this is something that they're also pursuing. So they're kind of also in opposition to Tawfiq, not just the British and French. And there's this one very famous exchange between Tawfiq and Urabi when they, kind of confronted one another, that I think very nicely illustrates what the movement is very rapidly becoming about. So Tawfiq is basically, unwilling to compromise. You have no right to ask for all these demands, for I, the Khalifa, have inherited this land, Egypt. What he's arguing there is pretty much akin to ruling by divine right? Government has no special obligation to the people in the sense of kind of representing their will. And therefore you have no right to make these demands. Urabi responds by saying, God has created us free. God did not create us to be inherited like property. I swear by Allah, and there is no God except him. From now on, we, i.e. Egyptians, will never be inherited or treated as slaves again. And, on the surface, that sounds, okay, he's deploying the language of Islam. But if you really look at it more closely, you can definitely see the influence of Enlightenment ideas about representative government. Some of this language actually very similar to what you find in the Declaration of Independence. God-given inalienable rights that rulers have no right to infringe upon. right? So, I mean, this does, albeit here being expressed in, shall we say, more indigenous terms. And so here we see an artistic depiction of this kind of, confrontational moment between Tawfiq and Urabi. Urabi on horseback with fellow members of the army. And, with art, you always try to think about what the artist is trying to convey. It's kind of interesting that Urabi is in the higher position here relative to Tawfiq. So, kind of presenting a very kind of powerful figure. And, it's funny, one of the justifications the British in particular had often used for building their colonial empire, for occupying other territories, was that they were promoting European ideals like democracy and representative government. You might imagine that they would look favorably upon the Urabi movement, maybe even support it. But in fact, they're not happy about this at all. Really, all they want to do is protect their investment. And in May 1882, the British and French stationed their fleets off the coast of Egypt near Alexandria, kind of a way of sending a message. We should add, too, that the British have become increasingly concerned about the Suez Canal in particular, which has become very important to the British Empire, particularly with respect to the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. The Suez Canal is sometimes referred to as the lifeline of the British Empire because it really does shorten the traveling distance between Britain and India. So they see this as kind of, a different kind of investment in Egypt. And so as, tensions begin to rise, at some point demonstrations are taking place, which eventually are going to become somewhat violent. The British fleet bombard Alexandria following widespread revolts, some of which does seem directed at kind of foreigner communities within Alexandria. And eventually the decision is taken to militarily occupy Egypt. Initially, it's supposed to be a joint British-French operation, but at the last minute, the French decide against taking part, and the British end up occupying Egypt by September of 1882, the decisive battle, the Battle of Tel-al-Kebir, after which the British are going to be militarily in control of Egypt. They initially claim, we're only here until we help you get your financial house in order. If we were doing this class live at this point, I would ask students to guess, when did the British finally evacuate Egypt entirely? And usually students guess, okay, it must be quite a bit down the road, maybe 1900, maybe the First World War. The British are not going to fully leave Egypt until 1954. And some of that will reflect the policies of the first British authority figure in Egypt, Evelyn Baring, also known as the first Earl of Cromer, or sometimes simply Cromer, who will serve initially as British controller and then later as agent and consul general of Egypt between 1879 and 1907. So even playing a role in Egypt prior to direct occupation, right, in connection with the dual financial control. So he really decided from an early point, or at least made the case to policymakers back in London, that it wouldn't be enough to reform the finances of Egypt, that there were kind of deeper, more deeply rooted problems that had to be addressed, many of which were politically, and therefore it was necessary for the British to maintain a presence in Egypt for the foreseeable future. And as was very often the case with British imperial policy, there is always a tendency to defer to who they refer to as Johnny on the spot, right? The individuals in the territories under consideration who they figured, being that they were on the ground, knew best. And so he would run Egypt in an autocratic manner. Before we move forward, though, I do want to also note that this kind of also reflects a general problem of occupying a country imperialistically. So very often a country might go in with one particular concern in mind, but the longer you stay there, you tend to develop new interests. And then the problem becomes, well, how do you extricate yourself from the country while maintaining these interests? You kind of get into this kind of situation of trying to come up with an arrangement, one very often unacceptable to the local population. And so you find it very difficult to get out. And one reason I'm kind of stressing this is, on the first hand, this is pretty much what would happen in Egypt, but it would be kind of a repeating pattern in the Middle East right up to the American occupation of Iraq, which, much as with the British in Egypt, was supposed to be short term, yet somehow decades later we find that, in one form or another, the occupation has continued until the present day. So certainly for many Middle Easterners, when the Americans came in and claimed that we're only going to be here for a short period of time, kind of a feeling of, seeing this movie before, we pretty much know how it goes, right? I did want to kind of draw attention to that aspect of it. Coming back to Cromer, well, as you might imagine, the British imperial presence in Egypt would probably, in many ways serve as a major catalyst for Egyptian nationalism, which would become increasingly pervasive. Again, nothing like a them, in this case, a them occupying your country to really, create a clearer sense of who the us are. In this case, that we are nationalistically speaking Egyptians. It was also a very kind of heavy-handed occupation. The British would interfere in Egyptian politics right down to the most minor detail. This became something greatly resented, and things finally came to a head with something known as the Denshaway Incident of 1906, which eventually forced Cromer to resign. So we might take a closer look at the Denshaway incident, right? It's really a brilliant illustration of, the kind of dynamic that had emerged by this point between the British and Egyptians, in the sense that the British pretty much acted as if they owned the place and were very, in a sense, disregarding local sensibilities, local customs, traditions, and so forth. So in June 1906, 5 British officers, while pigeon hunting near the village of Denshaway, accidentally set fire to a pile of grain on a village threshing floor. And by the way, this probably would have had a pretty severe impact on the collective livelihood of the village. As a consequence, a brawl broke out. 5 villagers, 2 officers killed, 1 officer later dying from heat stroke. And I think from our present-day perspective, it would be pretty clear that the British were at fault. If anything, they probably should have taken responsibility for what happened. Some kind of reparations, certainly an apology. But that is not how the British reacted at all. I mean, from their point of view, it was very important to put the Egyptians in their place, right? To really show them, who was boss, to put it bluntly. 52 members of the village were put on trial for murder. 32 found guilty, several flogged, and 4 male villagers hanged. And in fact, this did not really teach Egyptians a lesson. It didn't put them in their place. Rather, it pretty much outraged the entire Egyptian population. And if anything, really kind of brought the peasantry on board with Egyptian nationalism. To some degree, the peasantry up until this point, not particularly politically aware, politically active. This is going to change that. And for the first time, urban intellectual critics of the British regime, and by the way, it is among intellectuals that Egyptian nationalism would have been most prevalent, found common cause with the local peasantry. We should note one other development during this period that's actually going to resonate throughout the Middle East, which is an uprising that takes place in the Sudan, and reminding everyone that the Sudan is actually a part of Egypt at this point. And for many Egyptian nationalists, a very important part of Egypt. Later on, within British policy circles, there will be talk of severing the Sudan from Egypt, and given the current political map of the Middle East, obviously that is what eventually comes to pass. But for many Egyptian nationalists, this idea of holding on to the Sudan becomes like an important kind of rallying point of Egyptian nationalism. In any event, an uprising takes place in the Sudan, pretty much led by an Islamic fundamentalist movement headed by a fellow who takes the title Mahdi. an Islamic term representing a messianic figure that is supposed to come at the end of days. And what's really important here is that they actually defeat the British Army, headed by a fellow named Gordon, who himself dies in battle in 1885 near the town of Khartoum, hence why he's often referred to as Gordon of Khartoum. But up until this point, there really had been this kind of idea that the European armies, the British in particular, were fairly invincible. Militarily, you just couldn't defeat a European army. So this is going to be very inspiring for many people in the Middle East, right? Someone kind of showing that it can be done. And in fact, the Mahdi will go on to govern the Sudan for a period of time until the British are able to take it back. And that will happen under a fellow named Herbert Kitchener, who is sent to Egypt specifically to deal with the situation in the Sudan. He will be the commander-in-chief, or Sidar, of the Egyptian army, and will head an Anglo-Egyptian force to retake the Sudan in 1898, and they are successful. Who'll later go on to serve as Consul General of Egypt from 1911 to 1914. And to his credit, he kind of recognized that the British really needed to demonstrate, on the one hand, that there was some benefit derived of a continued British presence. And he also recognized that, one way of dealing with the growing pervasiveness of Egyptian nationalism would be to try and kind of wean the peasantry off of it. Right? Like if you can do something sufficiently beneficial for the peasantry, then they might reconsider their support of Egyptian nationalism. And a good example of that would be the Five Fedin Law, which sought to protect small landholders against seizure of property for debt. But really a case of too little, too late at this point. Before we go on to really look more closely at Egyptian nationalism as a kind of growing movement, just kind of an aside, some of you are probably thinking, gosh, that face looks pretty familiar. His face will eventually be used for these posters trying to recruit young British men to serve during the First World War, right? Kind of the equivalent of the Uncle Sam Wants You, with his image looking out and him pointing at prospective young British recruits during the First World War. He himself will actually die pretty early on in that conflict when he is on a naval vessel sunk by the Germans. Well, that's a bit of an aside. Returning to Egyptian nationalism. So during this kind of early period, this period of its early development, late 19th, early 20th century, probably the most prominent figures are going to be journalists, right? So this kind of reflects the growing influence of newspapers, kind of growing literacy rates. So more people are reading about Egyptian nationalism, different ideas related to it. Definitely a lot of stuff being written about how the British need to get out and so forth. Two very prominent early Egyptian nationalists are going to be the editors of newspapers. Mustafa Kemal, not to be confused with the Turkish Mustafa Kemal, who will later create the Turkish Republic, completely different guy. This one is born in Cairo in 1874 and will die in 1908. An Egyptian journalist, early nationalist, and editor of the newspaper Al-Liwa. And another important figure will be Ahmed Lutfi El-Sayed, who's an Egyptian lawyer, but also editor of the newspaper Al-Jarida. And he's a good example of someone who's not only writing about how the British need to get out, but actually starting to think about what kind of government Egypt might have if it becomes independent. So he's going to be a very strong advocate for secular liberal democracy. Also important during this period will be the rise of Egyptian political organizations, very much focusing on nationalistic themes. A really good example would be the Constitutional Reform Party, represented by such individuals as Mohammed Abdel and Rashid Rida. You're going to see those names quite a bit in the Hurani reading, and we're going to be talking about them again later in connection with Arab nationalism, which, by the way, is something a bit distinct from Egyptian nationalism, at least at this particular point in time. What they advocated was Egyptian independence within an Islamic framework. And again, we're going to be reading about these guys, kind of what they're advocating. Don't want to get too much into it, but just to say here, This is not a kind of anti-progress kind of movement. They're basically saying, yes, we believe in modernization, in progress, but we want to do it on the basis of our own values, not by imitating Europe. Modernization does not have to mean westernization. And then we also have the People's Party under the aforementioned Lutfi el-Sayed, the editor of the newspaper Al Jarida, who was advocating a secular liberal democracy, something a bit different than what the Constitutional Reform Party was promoting. And then finally, there was the National Party headed by Mustafa Kemal, who we already met. And he was kind of more like, let's not worry about what kind of government we're going to have. We have to focus on the immediate demand of a British evacuation. Eventually, the dominant figure within Egyptian nationalism is going to be Saad Zaghlul, born in 1859, and who will live until 1927. And by the period just before, during, and then after the First World War, he really becomes the most prominent Egyptian nationalist figure, kind of, the guy who represents the movement to whom all defer. And after the First World War, he's going to see an opportunity here, right? So we're going to look at this more closely when we look at Arab nationalism. But after the First World War, there's this kind of new kind of principle that's being floated around that's really kind of, becoming quite popular, particularly in the non-European world, called national self-determination. Something promoted by the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who argues that this should be one of the principles upon which we build a new international order. And the basic gist of it is that the various peoples of the world have the right to determine their own political future, which is kind of an anti-colonial kind of idea, right? That, for instance, if Egyptians want to be independent, they don't want to be controlled by the British, they should have the right to tell the British to get out. And so, the opportunity that presents itself here, and it's not just in Egypt, but this is going to be happening throughout much of the colonized world, that if we can send a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, which was kind of concluding the First World War, and hopefully with American support, and on the basis of this principle, right, we can kind of advocate and get international support for our independence. So he wants to create a delegation, the Arabic term for that is Wafd, to go to Paris to make the case for Egypt's independence. And by the way, again, he is like the most prominent nationalist figure in Egypt, will eventually go on to serve as prime minister of Egypt in 1924. Well, at some point, this proposed delegation is simply referred to as the Wafd. And the British are definitely not keen about the Wafd attending the Paris Peace Conference. And the British mistakenly convinced themselves that, really this is more about Zaghlul and a few other nationalists. They don't really represent what most Egyptians feel. If we can get them out of the picture, everything will settle down. So they actually have him and his compatriots deported to Malta. Malta is an island in the Mediterranean. Thinking that once he's out of the picture, once he's gone, things will settle down. Well, in fact, quite the opposite happens. Massive demonstrations break out in March of 1919, and eventually the British are forced to release Zaghlul and his fellow nationalists, and the Wafd will be permitted to attend the Paris Peace Conference. Again, they're counting on American support, but unfortunately that never comes. We should note there are probably two primary reasons for this. One is that Woodrow Wilson was probably thinking more about newly, quote-unquote, liberated territories in Europe with the dissolution of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire rather than non-European territories. And second of all, to whatever extent he might have lent support, it's not going to happen because he suffers a stroke during the Paris Peace Conference. So basically, the Egyptians will come back empty-handed. Having said that, the British really are beginning to understand that they're going to have to find some kind of compromise. So first, they send a commission to determine the cause of the disorders. This is a very standard practice within British imperialism, right? So, I mean, if you're a historian of British imperialism, you end up reading these reports quite frequently. Most of them never actually got read, right? It's kind of more, a way of paying lip service to the problem. Very often it's pretty clear what the problem is. In this case, the Egyptians want the British out, and whatever report is produced ends up gathering dust on a shelf. In the meantime, the British will try to negotiate a compromise with the Wafd, but this is again that problem of how do you maintain your national interests in the country while at the same time, in some sense, extricating yourself. Right, so the British are like, okay, can we give you independence, but we have kind of a list of things that we want to, kind of negotiate about, ensure that certain British interests, like the Suez Canal, are protected and so forth. And the Wafd are like, no, we insist on complete independence, which represents the popular view. Mistakenly, again, the British are hopeful that if we can get Zaghlul out of the picture, maybe other Egyptians will be more, quote unquote, reasonable. They deport Zaghlul. Again, mass demonstrations break out. And so finally, the British realize that, this is not just how Zaghlul feels, this is how most Egyptians feel. But still the problem, what do you do about it? In the end, the British unilaterally declare Egypt independent in 1922. And you might be thinking, well, okay, I imagine it's not perfect, but, surely it's something. Well, yes, they are independent apart from what come to be known as the 4 reserve points. So, Egypt is independent except that the British will maintain control of imperial communications, inclusive of the Suez Canal. They are independent except the British will maintain control over Egypt's defense against foreign aggression, i.e. over its defensive policy, but also over the army. They are independent apart from foreign interests and minorities. The British will determine to some extent Egyptian foreign policy and will have direct control over certain elements of the population, such as the Armenian and Jewish communities in Alexandria. And finally, Egypt is independent except for British control over the Sudan. But there is a new political system. The Wafd will eventually become a political party in connection with the creation of a parliamentary form of government. So there is a constitution that does allow for democratic institutions, including a legislative council and prime minister, which this body will have limited power. Ultimately, to some degree, will have to defer to the British. But it does provide mechanisms for continuing the struggle for real independence. So the Wafd will now become a political party, and Zaghlul often serving as prime minister. And so they will be the dominant party during the 1920s, coming into the 1930s, though eventually we do see the rise of other parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, and might surprise some people, communists. There's actually going to be a thriving communist party in Egypt during this period. But probably most important would be the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're not going to talk too much about them here. We actually have an assigned article about them that we're going to look at later. We'll get into them in much greater depth at that point. But a few basic, kind of facts that we should consider here. So founded by Hassan al-Banna in 1928, and eventually establishing branches throughout the Middle East, so that by some point they really do come to constitute the largest political opposition in most Arab nations, right? And we should note too that very often the different branches eventually kind of operating independently of one another in their respective territories. The other thing I want to point out is while they were certainly opposed to continued European imperial occupation of the Middle East, whether in Egypt or anywhere else, at some point they become much more focused on, in the case of Egypt, on the Egyptian government, particularly after the Second World War, some of which reflects that they disagree with kind of the secular character of that government. So very much like what we saw with Mohammed Abdul Rashid Rida, they weren't anti-progress. They believed in modernization, but they felt it should be on the basis of Islamic values, that it shouldn't mean imitating Europe, westernization. In any event, what's going to become very clear pretty early on is that this Egyptian government really has very little power at all. I mean, ultimately, it is the British who are calling the shots, something that becomes really clear when the British, think about that, British commander of the Egyptian army, Sir Lee Stack, is assassinated. And around that time, also pro-Egyptian riots break out in the Sudan. And the British are going to be pretty heavy-handed in their response. They don't act as if they're dealing with a foreign country that can make its own decisions. They pretty much demand that Egypt pay an apology fee for the assassination and withdraw Egyptian officers from the Sudan. And at the time, the Prime Minister is Zaghlul, and he agrees to the first demand, but he's like, I can't agree to the second. No Egyptian nationalist would accept the idea of withdrawing Egyptian officers from the Sudan, which would be tantamount to, kind of recognizing what is increasingly becoming the British position that the Sudan should be severed from Egypt. And ultimately, he is forced to resign in favor of a caretaker ministry. Complicating matters is going to be that in addition to the British and in addition to the Egyptian parliamentary government, you still have, well, at this point, the title is king, right? What had been the viceroy, eventually sultan, but now king, following Egyptian independence in 1922, is a third locus of power, right? So, and this is someone whom very often the British are quite happy to support in opposition to the parliament. And the king, in return, is quite happy to use the British as a way of enhancing his own authority. And so, for example, in 1930, the king at the time, King Fuad, will declare a state of emergency and replace the 1923 Constitution with a much more authoritarian one. And so he'll carry on until 1936, but his son Faruq, who succeeds him, pretty much the same deal. King Faruq will be the last ruling king of Egypt and will govern from 1936, when he succeeded his father, up until shortly after the Second World War. And one of the first things he does upon taking the throne is to sign the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, which pretty much kind of cements the British role in Egypt, at least for the next 20 years. And, probably first and foremost, for him, this was about, kind of suppressing the parliament in order to enhance his own position, kind of using the British in that way. Though no doubt it also reflected a genuine concern regarding Italian military activity in the region. They had recently invaded Ethiopia. They already occupied Libya on the border of Egypt. So the British would provide some protection against possible incursions from the Italians. We should note, too, that the terms of the treaty did pay at least a nod to at least a nod to Egyptian nationalist concerns, right? So according to the terms, Britain would withdraw all troops from Egypt, but would maintain a large military presence around the Suez Canal to be evacuated by 1949. But for most Egyptian nationalists, they just weren't prepared to compromise on nationalist goals, even to some small degree. They just had no trust for the British. And they also understood that a continued British role politically in Egypt would strengthen Farouk's position vis-a-vis the parliament, allowing him to rule in a dictatorial manner. All of this acting as a catalyst for Egyptian nationalism, which is just becoming much more pervasive during this period. Related to this, the number of daily newspapers and weekly magazines are growing. Literacy rates are going up. Most of the articles that you're reading from this period are about nationalistic or political problems. This isn't just kind of reporting events that are happening, but we're talking about editorials, people who are giving their opinion, trying to promote Egyptian nationalist support, and so forth. Alongside of this, we're seeing the development of a modern literature in Arabic. A lot of Egyptian authors writing novels and short stories dealing with nationalist themes. And then finally, we should note that this is a period that's going to see the beginning of the development of an Egyptian film industry and also recording industry. Regarding film, Egypt today actually one of the biggest producers of film in the world, probably fourth or fifth. I'm not sure anymore, but right behind the United States, China, and India. And even today, if you see a film in Arabic, the greater likelihood is that it was produced in Egypt. And regarding the recording industry, probably the most famous singer in Arabic of the 20th century came from Egypt and was operating during this period, her name being Kulthum. Maybe later on we'll listen to a sampling of her recordings, but a lot of different kinds of stories, songs about different topics, very often kind of romantic topics, but very often with a kind of nationalistic kind of underpinning, right? So all of these things are serving to kind of, to promote Egyptian nationalism and generate a feeling of commitment to the nationalist cause, which is primarily about getting the British out. And certainly if there was any illusion about Egypt being truly independent, the Second World War is going to bring an end to that. In 1942, the British ambassador in Egypt issued King Faruq an ultimatum demanding that he appoint a government willing to uphold the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. And this was somewhat understandable. With the Second World War having started, the British really wanted to make sure that they wouldn't have to send some of their army to Egypt to deal with problems there, particularly given that one of the fronts during the war would be in North Africa. And there had been some political figures demonstrating sympathy for Germany, though, not because they supported Nazism, but rather, a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of logic. So, that was in some ways understandable. But alongside the ultimatum, and just to make sure that Faruq signed it, the British surrounded the royal palace with tanks. And for many Egyptians, this was, just try to imagine as an Egyptian at this time what kind of image that would create, right? This was one of utter humiliation, clearly indicating that this kind of unilateral declaration of independence wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And Egyptians would not soon forget this episode. And with the conclusion of the Second World War, the British began to realize that they were going to have to get out, right? I mean, it was pretty clear that they were unwelcome. In addition to that, the British were broke after the Second World War. They're running into similar problems throughout their empire. So they're really having to think carefully about, well, okay, what are our interests, kind of minimally speaking, and how do we maintain them? Which colonies are most important to us, and so forth. And so with respect to Egypt, the British decided, okay, look, really the only thing we care about is the Suez Canal, the lifeline to the crown jewel of our empire, though, by the way, they're about to lose India as well. But, maybe not fully aware of what the consequences of that will be. But in any event, by 1947, most British troops had withdrawn to the Suez zone. They're like, okay, this is all we're going to hold on to. But for the Egyptians, even this was too much. And, by the way, the Suez Canal, very important for Egypt as well, right? Economically, obviously, it would be, a source of prestige and revenue and so forth. So they just found this untenable. And so tensions are really beginning to mount. And then on top of all that, and we're going to be looking at this in greater depth from kind of the other side, but with respect to developments in Egypt, let's just say that in 1948, the newly created state of Israel declares its independence and very quickly will be in a state of war with the neighboring Arab states who are sympathetic to the Palestinian Arab population that was thus displaced. Among them, Egypt. And, just to kind of give you the short story, the war is going to go very poorly for the Arab states, and it will be in many respects a rather humiliating defeat. In the case of Egypt, this is going to do a lot to discredit the existing government, the king, and only exacerbate the situation with respect to the British. So it's against this background that, anti-British sentiment is really just going to, completely explode. And the government, the Egyptian government, under tremendous pressure to demonstrate that it can do something about anything, at some point sending Egyptian commandos into the Canal Zone to fight against British troops. At some point, the British retaliate militarily. 50 Egyptian policemen end up being killed. And at that point, demonstrations are going to break out throughout the major cities, particularly in Cairo, and very quickly degenerating into riots until it really becomes apparent that the government is no longer able to govern. And it is against that background that a military coup will take place, headed by the Free Officers Movement. This takes place on July 23rd, 1952, and they effectively overthrow the old regime, at which point a military junta takes control of the government. And initially it seems that the head of this movement is a fellow named Muhammad Naguib, kind of elderly figure, a general, but at some point it becomes clear that he was really a figurehead, just someone who would seem respectable and recognizable to most Egyptians. And by early 1954, it's pretty clear that the real leader of the new regime is a fellow named Gamal Abdel Nasser. And that is a pretty good place to stop. We'll definitely be looking at him later, but he will, just to kind of give you a bit of a preview, will become the hero of Pan-Arabism, the hero of the Arab world up until his death in 1970, and will govern Egypt as president, though in fact with the powers almost effectively of a dictator. Having said that, he's even until today an extremely popular figure in Egypt. So if you should find yourself in Egypt, I would strongly recommend that you do not say anything anything negative about Mr. Nasser. So we're going to stop there. And when we pick up the story, we're going to kind of return to the Ottoman Empire and look at developments towards the end of the 19th century.